There are moments in Genoa City when the destruction of a marriage does not begin with betrayal itself, but with the terrifying instant when someone realizes the damage is bigger than the original sin. It is bigger than one lie, one act of weakness, one terrible decision made in private. It becomes a web of old loyalties, buried resentments, and poisonous patterns that have been allowed to survive for years because too many people found it easier to call them family tradition instead of emotional violence. That is the place Diane finds herself standing in now, with her heart still burning from Jack's latest failure, and with Nikki reaching out as if peace can be arranged through sheer will, as if enough grace and civility can somehow put the broken pieces back where they once belonged. But Diane is past the point of polite repair. She is no longer interested in comforting illusions. What Nikki sees as a chance for reconciliation, Diane sees as one more insult layered on top of years of damage, one more attempt to soften a truth that has already become impossible to survive gently. For Nikki, the decision to contact Diane is not entirely selfless, though she tries to frame it that way in her own mind. She tells herself she is stepping forward because too much has already been lost, because the hostility between them is helping no one, because Jack's life is unraveling, and the longer Diane remains isolated in her anger, the harder it will be for anyone to stop this situation from hardening into permanent disaster. But underneath that, practical instinct is something more personal and much less comfortable. Nikki feels the tremor of guilt she never fully admits, even to herself. She knows Victor has crossed lines for years in his endless obsession with controlling enemies, punishing insults, and rewriting reality so that everyone around him is forced to live under the shadow of his power. She also knows that she has spent far too much of her life learning how to survive those storms rather than truly stopping them. Nikki has justified her silence in 100 ways over the years. Love, loyalty, exhaustion, fear of what Victor becomes when challenged too directly, fear of the chaos that follows when his rage is unleashed without restraint. She has told herself that maintaining peace inside the marriage often meant absorbing what she could not fix. But now she is being forced to see that what she called peace may have simply been a slower form of surrender. Diane, meanwhile, is no longer willing to separate Jack's betrayal from the ecosystem that made it possible. That is the shift Nikki does not fully grasp until it is too late. Diane is not just angry at a husband who failed her. She is angry at the history that taught him he could be pulled back into old emotional traps, old obligations, old reckless attempts to save or prove something through Nikki. She is furious that Nikki continues to occupy a place in Jack's moral landscape that has always made Diane feel like an outsider in her own marriage. To Diane, the issue is not merely that Nikki is Victor's wife. It is that Nikki has always represented a dangerous weakness in Jack, a loyalty so old and so emotionally loaded that it leaves room for manipulation, confusion, and blurred boundaries. Diane has spent too much time watching her marriage bend under the weight of histories that were never hers. She has had to endure the ugly knowledge that no matter how committed Jack claimed to be, there were still ghosts in the room, and Nikki's name was always one of the loudest. When Nikki reaches out with hopes of a truce, Diane does not hear compassion. She hears management. She hears a woman trying to reduce the scale of the explosion before more collateral damage falls on the Newman Empire, on Jack, on Victor, on the fragile public image both families are always desperate to maintain. Diane has become too raw, too wounded, and too clear-eyed to accept that kind of gesture at face value. She sees Nikki's olive branch as an attempt to contain the narrative, to make the whole thing feel less like systemic betrayal and more like a painful misunderstanding between adults. But Diane does not want the edges softened. She wants the truth sharpened. She wants someone to finally say aloud that Victor's behavior has not been the isolated madness of a difficult man, but the prolonged abuse of power enabled by the people closest to him, especially the woman who always seems to find a reason to forgive him once the smoke clears. That is why Nikki's effort fails before it truly begins. Diane is no longer angry in the ordinary sense. She has crossed into a colder territory, where each word, each memory, each accusation has settled into a hard structure inside her. She is no longer asking who made the first mistake. She is asking who kept allowing the cycle to continue. Jack becomes the silent center of this crisis, even when he is not in the room. His mistakes have detonated something that cannot be controlled through apologies, and that realization begins to consume him. He can feel Diane pulling further away, not just emotionally but morally, as if she is revising her entire understanding of who he is and what their marriage meant. That frightens him more than anger would. Anger, at least, leaves room for reaction. Anger can burn itself out. But the disappointment growing inside Diane feels more permanent. It carries contempt. It carries fatigue. It carries the unbearable possibility that she is beginning to view him not as a flawed man who broke her trust, but as someone fundamentally too weak to protect what mattered. Jack tries to defend himself privately, tries to reconstruct the choices that led him here in a way that preserves some dignity, some rationale. But every path leads back to the same humiliating fact. He allowed himself to be dragged into emotional terrain where Victor could once again use Nikki, history, and unresolved loyalty as weapons. And Diane knows it. That knowledge changes her posture entirely. She is no longer pleading for understanding or waiting for proof that Jack will choose her unequivocally. Instead, she begins to take stock of the battlefield around her. The Abbott mansion no longer feels like a home. It feels like a site of contamination. Every room stained by resentment, every shared memory suddenly suspicious. She sees not just one marriage crisis, but the larger power struggle that has been moving beneath it all along. Victor attacks, Nikki minimizes, Jack rationalizes, and Diane is expected to absorb the emotional consequences with grace. She is done with that role. She begins thinking less like a wounded wife and more like a strategist. What would it mean to stop reacting and start acting? What would it mean to refuse reconciliation, refuse softness, refuse the pressure to be the bigger person, and instead force everyone else to sit inside the ugliness they helped create? This thought begins as pain, but slowly it hardens into purpose. Nikki, sensing the refusal, becomes more unsettled than she expected. She thought Diane might lash out, might reject the overture, but part of her still believed there would be enough shared understanding between two women who both know the burden of loving difficult men. Instead, what she finds in Diane is something sharper and less forgiving. Diane is not asking for empathy from Nikki because she no longer believes Nikki deserves the role of comforter. That lands harder than Nikki wants to admit. It forces her to confront a fear she has spent years suppressing, the possibility that her loyalty to Victor has not merely protected her marriage, but damaged her moral credibility in the eyes of nearly everyone around her. Nikki has always believed she was more nuanced than Victor, more compassionate, more aware of the human cost of his vendettas. But what good is awareness if it never leads to resistance? What good is compassion if, in the end, it is always reserved for the man causing the destruction rather than the people left to survive it? Diane's rejection exposes that contradiction so brutally that Nikki begins to feel cornered by truths she cannot easily dismiss. Victor, predictably, interprets the entire situation through the language of control. He sees Diane's anger not as justified pain but as hostility that must be neutralized before it spreads into something more dangerous. He knows the emotional fallout from Jack's failure is creating a fracture he can exploit, but he also knows Diane is not a woman who breaks quietly. If she decides to expose old wounds, old manipulations, old dirty tactics that Victor would prefer left unexamined, she could make life difficult in ways even he cannot fully predict. So Victor begins to maneuver, subtly at first. He pushes Nikki to keep trying. He encourages a narrative of reconciliation, of healing, of women finding common ground despite the mistakes of men. But beneath that polished framing is a more ruthless calculation. If Diane can be persuaded to redirect her anger toward Jack alone, Victor escapes with far less damage. If Nikki can pull Diane into some fragile understanding, then the broader system remains intact. Victor does not need forgiveness. He needs containment. Unfortunately for him, Diane senses the shape of that trap almost instinctively. The more Nikki tries to appear sincere, the more Diane becomes convinced that she is walking into a campaign rather than a conversation. Her suspicion intensifies when small things begin to happen around her, things too precise to feel accidental. A legal concern suddenly surfaces involving an old Abbott business matter. A private social embarrassment nearly becomes public. An opportunity Diane had been quietly pursuing begins to collapse under murky circumstances. None of it is enough to prove Victor's hand directly, but taken together it creates a suffocating atmosphere. Diane begins to suspect that reconciliation is being offered with one hand, while pressure is being applied with the other. If she stays angry, she will be painted as unstable, stubborn, destructive. If she agrees to peace, she will be absorbed back into a system designed to silence her. The realization infuriates her because it confirms the exact pattern she has spent years enduring. Women in this world are expected to survive male destruction, tidy up the ruins, and call it maturity. Jack sees pieces of this but far too late. His remorse grows more desperate, but desperation only makes him clumsier. He wants Diane to believe that his regret is real, that he understands the scale of what he has cost her, but he is still trapped in old instincts. He wants resolution without fully surrendering control. He wants forgiveness while still managing perception. He wants Diane back without confronting the humiliating truth that part of the reason he is losing her is because he never fully severed the invisible emotional current that Nikki represented in his life. To Diane, that failure is the deepest betrayal of all. It is not that Jack made one catastrophic mistake. It is that he lived for too long in a state of divided allegiance while pretending otherwise. He wanted to be a devoted husband and the eternal rescuer, the principled man and the nostalgic protector, the person Diane could trust and the person Victor could still bait through old history. In the end, those contradictions destroyed him. That destruction becomes more visible as he starts to unravel. The composed Abbott image begins to crack. His frustration spills into business decisions, family tensions, and private moments where his mask slips and panic shows through. He is terrified not just of losing Diane, but of what her rejection says about him. If Diane, after everything, decides he is not worth the pain anymore, then he cannot hide behind excuses about external forces or manipulative enemies. Then he has to face himself. This is why Jack starts making mistakes that worsen the crisis. He pushes too hard. He shows up at the wrong moments. He tries to force emotional breakthroughs Diane does not want to grant. Each failed attempt humiliates him further and convinces Diane even more strongly that he still does not understand the damage. He sees reconciliation as the end goal. She sees accountability as the beginning, and they are no longer even standing in the same emotional room. Meanwhile, Nikki begins to fracture under a different kind of pressure. Diane's rejection leaves her carrying not only her own guilt, but Victor's expectations and Jack's deterioration. She is pulled in every direction and begins to resent all of them for it. Resent Jack for making such a mess of everything. Resent Victor for once again dragging her into the fallout of his obsessions. Resent Diane for forcing truths to the surface that Nikki has spent years learning how to live around. But beneath all that resentment is something even more dangerous. Self-loathing. Nikki starts replaying years of compromises, years of swallowing moral discomfort in exchange for stability, years of telling herself that loving Victor meant understanding his darkness without becoming consumed by it. Diane's refusal forces Nikki to consider that perhaps she has already been consumed, only in a quieter way. Not through cruelty, but through adaptation. Not through overt malice, but through repeated surrender. That thought terrifies her because it threatens the story she has always told herself about who she is. As Nikki struggles, Victor senses the risk of losing her emotional obedience and tightens his grip. He does not do it with obvious force. He rarely needs to. He uses intimacy, history, selective vulnerability, and the old rhythm of their marriage to pull her back toward his version of events. He reminds her of what they have survived together, of the enemies who have tried to tear them apart, of the need to protect family over outsiders. It is effective because it speaks directly to the part of Nikki that still equates endurance with love. But the effect is no longer total. Diane has already planted the deeper wound. Nikki can no longer ignore that. Protecting Victor often means sacrificing pieces of herself. The conflict inside her becomes almost unbearable. She wants peace, yet everything around her has been built on denying truth for the sake of peace. She wants Diane to stop attacking, yet she cannot honestly say Diane is wrong. She wants Victor to be less monstrous, yet she has helped create the conditions under which he could keep being exactly that. Diane, seeing Nikki's discomfort, feels no urge to soften. In fact, Nikki's pain almost strengthens her resolve because for once the emotional burden is shifting away from her. She has spent too much of her life being the one forced to explain herself, defend herself, reinvent herself, survive judgment. Now others are squirming under scrutiny, and she is not eager to relieve them. That does not mean she is at peace. Far from it. Her anger is eating at her in corrosive ways. It leaves her restless, suspicious, unable to trust even moments of silence. She starts preparing for the possibility that everything around her may need to be burned down before she can rebuild anything honest. Financial protections, emotional boundaries, quiet alliances. She begins speaking to lawyers, reviewing assets, tracing connections, not necessarily because she has decided to end everything, but because she no longer believes safety can be assumed. The woman who once fought for her place beside Jack is slowly becoming someone willing to walk away with precision and leave everyone else choking on the consequences. That evolution frightens Jack more than anything Victor could do. He starts to realize that Diane is not waiting for him anymore. She is adapting to a future without him, and once Diane shifts into survival mode, she becomes far harder to manipulate through sentiment. In a panic, Jack turns his frustration outward. He begins confronting the structures around him with greater aggression, including Victor. But these confrontations are fueled by humiliation rather than clarity. Victor easily senses that weakness and uses it to his advantage, provoking him just enough to make him appear unstable, bitter, reckless. The old rivalry reignites, but this time it carries a more poisonous edge because Jack is no longer fighting only over pride or history. He is fighting against the possibility that Victor may once again outlast him emotionally, that Victor may remain in Nikki's life, in the center of power, in control of the narrative, while Jack is left standing in the ashes of a marriage he failed to protect. That prospect drives him into darker reactions. His anger stops being noble and starts becoming self-destructive. Family members begin to notice. The atmosphere around the Abbotts grows tense, then brittle, then openly volatile. Every interaction feels charged with things unsaid. Diane's refusal to reconcile with Nikki starts rippling outward, not as a contained personal dispute, but as a fault line exposing every old resentment the families have been trying to bury. Sides begin forming, even among those who claim neutrality. Some believe Diane is justified and long overdue in naming the real problem. Others think she is letting fury turn her into something dangerous. Some think Nikki is finally trying to do the right thing. Others see only another polished attempt to excuse Victor by distributing the blame. In Genoa City, no wound stays private for long. Emotional injury becomes leverage, and leverage becomes strategy. Before long, what began as a rejected olive branch starts to resemble the opening move in a much larger war. And at the center of that war sits the cruelest truth of all. Nikki wanted peace, but peace, built on denial, is only delayed destruction. Diane understands that now, with a clarity that feels almost brutal. She is done pretending that reconciliation is inherently noble. Sometimes reconciliation is just another word used to pressure the wounded into silence. Sometimes forgiveness is demanded not because justice has been done, but because everyone else is tired of the noise pain makes when it refuses to behave. Diane will not play that role anymore. She will not smile for the sake of balance. She will not absolve Nikki because Nikki feels guilty. She will not give Jack access to redemption simply because he has finally recognized the size of his mistake. And she certainly will not lower her guard, while Victor still lurks behind every conversation like the architect of chaos he has always been. So the city braces, whether it knows it or not, because what is coming now is not a healing arc. It is a reckoning. Diane's fury has moved beyond heartbreak and into strategy. Nikki's guilt is mutating into rebellion, though she may not yet admit it. Jack's desperation is pushing him toward choices that could cost him whatever dignity he has left. Victor, sensing control slipping by inches, is preparing to strike harder, cleaner, and with less patience than before. No one is innocent. No one is stable. No one is standing on safe ground. The offer of reconciliation has already failed, and in its place something far more dangerous has been born. Not peace, not closure, not forgiveness, but a raw and escalating power struggle where love is mixed with pride, loyalty is poisoned by fear, and every old wound is suddenly sharpened into a weapon. In a town built on grudges and glamour, that is when families stop pretending to be families and start revealing what they have truly become.